kind words. And do you see the slides? Maybe that's the first question. Do you see the slides? Thumbs up. That's good. Cool. Law of large numbers, obviously being a pun here, is the title of this talk I want to present today. And it's, in fact, the pun is pretty much showing as well what is the difficulty here, because this work is joint work with Alina, who's a lawyer. Mara, she's not a lawyer. Bob and myself, we are not lawyers at all. We come from machine learning. But Alina's a lawyer, and she's interested as well. Parts of her work is going about the EU AI Act. And it was actually the reason why we met, because we were talking about accuracy in very different ways. And we noticed, like, okay, there's so much confusion around this term. Let's get this right. That was the start of the journey, but the journey continued a bit differently. And but for the purpose of the talk, let me start it in a different way. So I guess most of you who are in the audience at the moment are machine learning people. And so I just assume that for you MLers, it's clear, you know what accuracy is, right? Accuracy is this mathematical formula. It's like the ratio of correct predictions. And you essentially can use it to calculate the fraction of correctly predicted images, correctly predicted answers to questions, and so on. And obviously, an accurate ML system is one which outputs true answers. And as well, obviously, accuracy can be used to essentially compete for performance. So compare each other on different benchmarks like SciFi or ImageNet. And all of these things are so obvious to us that it's like, for us, it should be clear what accuracy is, right? It turns out that in the last couple of years, ML essentially left the laboratory and entered into the wild. And it hit different, in this case, just some titles and headlines. Pretty much all saying machine learning AI is coming, does it solve problems, and so on. Interestingly, it as well led to something which is the EU AI Act. So a piece of regulation which got written because machine learning essentially entered our social life. Okay? And if we look a bit closer at this specific article, for instance, which reads as high-risk systems shall be designed and developed in such a way that they achieve an appropriate level of accuracy, we notice, well, the people actually use our terms. So accuracy is something people using, we know what it is, and funnily enough, in the UAI Act, it's not even defined. So now it's just easy. We can explain to everybody what accuracy is, right? It's our term. We can say what it is. But then I met Alina. And essentially it was two penguins who clashed. Okay. So it turned out like the concept of accuracy, how she understood it when reading the UII Act and never hearing about the technical story before, was very, very different to what I understood as accuracy. Okay. For this reason, we thought, well, maybe we can resolve this clash. And it turned out that hard to do so. Instead, maybe we should take a different approach. And the approach which we took is the following. We said, well, accuracy is maybe then just more what we machine learning people thought. And as well, it's maybe more than what the lawmakers and law people thought what it is. So essentially, we treat accuracy as what is called in science technology studies a boundary object. Okay, a boundary object is like there's one famous person, Susan Ley-Starr, who defined it as an analytic concept of those scientific objects which inhabit different intersecting social worlds, but they satisfy as well requirements of each of them simultaneously. Okay, and accuracy is a nice thing here because is a nice example here because it's like it's applying to the law world in a certain way. It's applying to the world of machine learning engineers and researchers, but it seems to be different if you look at it from different perspectives. So what I want to see is like accuracy is both the things. It's like it's the perspective of an engineer, but as well is the perspective of the lawyer. So what I'm going to use as a tool here, just to mark this as a difference, I will call it E accuracy and L accuracy, but I don't want to have it understood as being two different things. It's like it's talking about the same thing, but from a very different angle. Okay. That's essentially the story. Okay. Now, to have a running example to make it a bit more clear what the accuracy is and what are the concepts, because it's going to be a lot of text, in fact, I'm going to introduce the following running example. Imagine we have the following AI system. It's, well, a bit maybe over the top, but could be used. We imagine there's persons who apply, so they write an application. Then there's a company. In this case, it's just a very hierarchical company. And the application is then essentially ingested by an AI system, which as well gets some requirements set by the company, like what we want as a job description, for instance. And this AI system at the end tells us a number, which is kind of like a fit score for hiring. Why is this a nice running example? So the EU AI Act applies to what is called high-risk AI systems. So only AI systems which fulfill certain purposes or are intended to be used for certain purposes. And hiring is one of them, okay? There's others like education, as well, like safety in terms of public safety when you do police controlling. It's as well when it's about economical resources. So there's a bunch of different applications where it matters, or as well health might be another one. And the other reason why this is a reasonable example from a machine learning perspective is like it's kind of solvable. Okay, we can make such a system. Whether it's good or not, whether it's useful or not, and it's not clear, but it would be possible with the current techniques which we have. Cool. So let's start with the first perspective, the machine learning engineer's perspective on accuracy. So what is E-accuracy? And I'm going to argue that it has certain properties. First and foremost, it's an informal and empirical concept. It fully defines the performance of a machine learning model or system. It is a comparative measure of performance. I'm going to tell you more about this later. And finally, it's a statistical measure of quality, in particular for statistical systems. Okay. And all of these abstract points, like you're going to notice later, they're going to be contrasted with the L accuracy view. And we're going to see some differences there. Let me go through the points step by step. The formal empirical concept. Well, the classical definition of accuracy is the fraction of correct prediction. That's easy. But so what is accuracy if it's not maybe about classification? In fact, is accuracy so important that it's specifically the fraction of correct predictions? One could argue it's actually just some metric. Let's say it's true positive rate, false positive rate is another type of accuracy, or mean squared error is another type of accuracy, and some given data. Okay, so the metric might capture usefulness or goodness in a different setup. If you look at true positive or false, true negative rates or false positive rates, depending on how you frame it, they can be capturing different types of usefulness, different types of interest as well of the partners involved. For example, in the hiring thing I was telling you earlier, if you imagine that the score is a number between 1 and 10 of fitness, then maybe the company is not interested in getting it right, like getting the right score, but essentially getting a score which is not too high than the actual true score, okay, of this person. This would be a type of a metric which could be used. In fact, like in a paper which is part of my dissertation, we argued all of these choices at the end are just choices of a gambler. So it's pretty much like it's a restricted and limited view of what can be done when we do accuracy evaluation and choose a metric. The second ingredient on a more general level than if we just look at this classical definition of accuracy is the data set. Okay. And funnily enough, like we assume that data sets are given pretty much in all parts of machine learning and AI research. Bob made a nice argument about this, is like as well in terms of the origin of the word data. It's like from datum, which is like from the Latin word to be given. So we in the definition of data, it's like it's a given thing. We assume that this is something which is there, and we just take it and we can use it to evaluate, for instance, in the hiring system, whether it's good or not. As well, it's true because it's revealed to us by annotators. And sure, there's some arguments about whether it's true or not, in terms of an ontic truth, a truth in the world. On the other hand, when we measure accuracy, we treat the labels which we get by the annotators as true. Otherwise, we could not measure the accuracy in the first place. So again, in the hiring setup, as the running example, the data set would be essentially a bunch of people having applied. It's maybe a scraped LinkedIn profiles, and then you would take annotators. So you might just take HR people in your company and ask them what would you give them as a score, and then you would evaluate this method by saying, well, if the method gives a score which is higher than the score the HR people said, then it's a bad model, or like it's a bad prediction machine here. And you're gonna optimize for you're gonna train the model in a different way to check out whether it's getting more accurate. But more on this later on. So you as well notice that accuracies, in particular in machine learning, is very tightly related to benchmarks already here. Now, one of the standard tricks which Bob told me when I started my PhD with Bob is Bob said, whenever you want to ask the question, what is something, don't ask this. Just ask, what is this thing used for and what does it do? Okay, and then you're gonna get a better answer. And so I just did the simple trick here, and it's working out. So if you asked, well, what is accuracy doing? Then and how is it used? Then essentially, it's pretty much for one purpose. It's for optimization. Okay, when you're closer to development, it's really for optimization on machine learning methods. So it's this accuracy thing is capturing an abstract general performance, and we want to hit the benchmark. There is, for instance, a workshop series you might know, where essentially they notice you would argue your model is better, but at the end it turns out on benchmark it's not better, which essentially says essentially we are optimizing for accuracy here only. If you're closer to deployment, I guess people are a bit more aware of the problem that it needs to be somewhat related to the use case. So you can't just make it extremely abstract general performance measure here, but you would rather go for something which is a bit more related to the task at hand. But at the end, still, it's just how would you use it? You would use it to decide which machine learning method to use, and which one would you use? The more accurate one. It's for the optimization. So essentially, the accuracy defines the performance of the machine learning model. And it defines it, in particular, through the outcomes. It's just looking at what the system gives you, okay? Machine learning, the machine learning community is obviously not blind. So people noted that whenever you use accuracy, it's limited in terms of defining performance, specifically when you go to social setups. So there are problems like a target construct mismatch. In this hiring example, this would be essentially you would not give, the target would be you actually want to hire good people, but then you in your construct you essentially score you essentially score a person just because they have fulfilled certain goals in terms of their educational career, but then there's a mismatch between estimating the fit of the person to the company and the ability of the person which you derive from the educational life. There's as well a second problem which has been this guy has gotten some more attention as well by Julian, for instance, is which I would call no interventional insight. So there are what has been called performative effects, of prediction. So whenever we intervene with the machine learning method, it turns out that accuracy is not a nice way to define or even like grasp the quality of the predictions and hence the performance of the machine learning model used. So there's different problems with this, with the interventional aspect here. It's like there's going to be changes which can be caused because of the application of a machine learning model. It can as well be just simple things like whenever in this hiring setup, for instance, whenever we make a prediction and it's very accurate in terms of having a nice score, it's not clear whether it's a useful tool in the first place. So it's rather maybe a better idea to think about the application of this fit for hiring tool as an intervention, and we measure the interventional effect. I'm telling you, like, I mean, some of you work on this, so you know this better than I do. So essentially, I think people recognize that there are some limits here to accuracy in defining performance. And then there's a limitation to it, which I'd call that it's only of a comparative type, okay? And I'm going to talk about this a bit more in detail. So when we zoom in a bit better on this performance thing, specifically on having performance and accuracy, sorry, as an objective, it turns out that essentially we don't talk about being accurate as a status, but essentially talking about being more accurate than something else, okay? So essentially, we talk about a relative comparison between models. This is what's happening when we talk about benchmarks. So in benchmarks, it's not the score, which matters so much as whether the score is better than the other systems. And the nice thing about this is that you need less validity claims in the setup. So what I mean by this is the following. In the hiring setup, I have an algorithm, and I can get the scores, and I can just check out whether it's accurate or not. And it might as well be the case that I get a different algorithm. Okay, let's call it model 2, like model 1, model 2. Both give me scores. One is more accurate than the other one. Now, it turns out that when we want to make the claim that this ranking model 1 is still better than model 2 holds as well in a certain application setup, that the validity claims, the arguments to making this claim to be valid, they can be somewhat weaker than just saying the system which I'm gonna the system which I'm gonna deploy is accurate. Okay, so the relative comparison makes it easier to argue that the validity holds true. This is theoretically backed and as well empirically backed by nice papers such as the do ImageNet classifiers generalized to ImageNet for people who know this work a bit better. And the interesting thing as well is that validity claims beyond this comparison, they are often hard to hold. So if we want to make the statement that it's not model 1 is better than model 2, but instead we want to say model 1 is still good on a different population, on a population I've not seen before, then this is way harder. Hence, accuracy is somewhat limited in defining the performance because it only has this comparative character from a machine learning perspective. It's all what we need when we do competition, but it's as well as a kind of limitation, towards how we use it. Finally, for the machine learning side, e-accuracy or accuracy is a statistical measure of quality, which just means it's a measurement over an aggregate of outputs. So it's not measured on an individual, it's measured over an aggregate. And particularly, the machine learning models as well, they are statistical systems, okay? They are outputs based on aggregate data. They are as well outputs which are rationalized to be good because they have performed well on a certain aggregate of data. So it's always an argument about an aggregate of data, an aggregate of individuals, and it's hence a statistical way of arguing for the quality here. The observation, which is somewhat very simple, but it's important to note because it's going to be later important for one of the takeaways, is that accuracy, even though it's a statistical measure, it applies to systems which are not necessarily statistical. Okay, so this study which I cite here is number one. It's Days, I don't know how to pronounce his name, and Paul Meal, who had a paper called Clinical versus Actuarial Judgment, essentially applying a type of accuracy measurement to a bunch of to a set of clinicians and judge whether their clinical judgments were accurate or not. And obviously you can do this, but you treat the clinicians there as if they were a statistical system. And then on the other hand, being statistical, it's very hard to argue that there's something like an individually accurate statistical system. Okay. Mainly because essentially you will end up with all of the problems of individual probability, individualized estimates, and so on, which you, like as statisticians, you know that there's the reference class model. As machine learning people, you know there's the model multiplicity problem. So whenever you zoom down to an individual, having an accurate model essentially doesn't tell you anything about whether this specific individual has been classified in the correct way or not. Nice. So as a summary, machine learning perspective, maybe some new facets which you were not so aware of, maybe everything like old for you. It's a formal empirical concept. It pretty much defines the performance of a machine learning system and model. It's a comparative measure of performance, and it's a statistical one. Yeah. So yeah. Let me make a short break here, and then I'm going to start with the next slide. Okay, so e-accuracies, the perspective, I'd say, which is probably more familiar to most of the people listening to the talk at the moment, and as well, it's more familiar to my perspective. But we're interested in seeing the blue penguin coming in. So what is L-accuracy? What's the lawyer's perspective on accuracy? Number one, it's a part of compliance measures and a part of performance. It certifies something like no harm and performance. It's somewhat a teleological concept. I'm going to explain that later. It's a concept which is applicable to individuals and subgroups. And it's a legal quality criterion, which is comparable to other legal quality criteria. Okay. In the AI Act, accuracy applies to what has been called high-risk AI systems. Okay. High-risk AI systems depend on this intended purpose of the AI system. And as well, what is an AI system? Like there's some definition around it. Essentially, you can understand an AI system as like a machine learning system, which is somewhat not too easy. So maybe a linear regression is not fulfilling to be an AI system yet. And it's used in a context where it's somewhat sensitive. Health, economical things, education are examples for that. And the hiring example, obviously. In Article 15, as I was showing you earlier, there is there's a specific demand for an appropriate level of accuracy. Okay? And on top of that, there's as well in different articles distributed a bit, a demand for the report of accuracy. Okay? It's like there's a slight difference. Appropriate level of accuracy means the system needs to be accurate, and the second one's just like you need to say what is this accuracy. The Article 15 is usually taken to be the more central one, because the report of accuracy is then just something which is in technical documentations and instructions of use, and it depends on the legal persons involved who has to report what. Importantly, accuracy is embedded with robustness in cybersecurity in this Article 15. So there's as well other terms floating around it. And it's as well embedded in something which is called performance. So it's actually a fun observation which you can make in the UAI Act. You're not gonna find a definition of accuracy, but you're gonna find a definition of performance. But then if you look into the rest of the AI Act, pretty much everything which is used as a word is always accuracy, and performance is not ever used again. So there's been some scholars, for instance, Philip Hacker and some people who suggested that essentially we should understand as accuracy as a part of performance, or even as performance. And performance itself is defined as the ability of an AI system to achieve its intended purpose. Okay, so rather holistic conception here. Again, we do the bot move. We do the bot move and ask, what is this accuracy actually used for? Why is it in the AI Act? And what we're going to find is something which can be listed in three parts. It's part of a compliance measure to mitigate risks, as well to manage expectations for people when they deploy it, to know whether it's going to be accurate, and to monitor performance when the system is going to be used over time and over again. Here, just as a side note, I don't know whether you've ever read into law articles, like an actual law text. The law text consists of obviously the articles, but as well of something called recitals, and that's what it's called, like rec here, REC. The recitals are non-binding parts of an act where they essentially describe the purpose of the legislation in the first place. Okay. And in the recitals, they are usually used to interpret the better what is meant afterwards in the articles, but they are not legally binding. So it can be the case that courts rule against some of these ideas at the end. And there's as well the resource. Oh, sorry, I forgot the monitor performance here. There's as well the resources where you can find these points of where, why do we use something like accuracy? In terms of to make it easier to understand in terms of the example for the hiring, earlier from the machine learning perspective, hiring was always in terms of we want to get a good score, and good scores pretty much matching what the HR people said. Here, being accurate means a bit like a different thing, right? It's not anymore about getting a better performance, but it's rather that the performance is such that a person who gets hired is not hurt, that there's no harm involved. So for instance, that they get ignored because of the system is not accurate enough or something. So it's a different idea of accuracy already here on a very simple level. And then if we look into the more conceptualization of the use and the term accuracy in the AI Act, we're going to notice that accuracy cannot be just an arbitrary thing. It's not this abstract general concept. It's actually something which we always need to be we always need to connect to the intended purpose of the AI system. So the intended purpose of an AI system makes it a high risk thing or not. And as well, it's part of people who define who use an AI system. They need to define the intended purpose in the first place. So accuracy is always in link with this intended purpose and has this kind of pragmatic stance. It's always contextualized. In addition, what is very important is that this accuracy thing is closely linked to robustness, and as well to robustness in a different way, because it says that accuracy needs to hold throughout the life cycle of the AI system, which is a robustness of a temporal dimension, essentially saying, well, whatever's going to come as populations, what's ever going to happen to the AI system, it needs to be accurate in a certain way. So accuracy here it's more it's way more concentrated on the validity of the accuracy measurement than it was before in the machine learning conception, because it's important that it's robust in certain ways. As well, remind the use and purpose of accuracy as motivated by the recitals before. And then a conclusion from this, that's the warrants, so essentially the certificates for the validity of accuracy, they are very central. The reason for this is that, for instance, the EU AI Act has a focus on a procedural legislation, which means that whenever you choose data sets for training and testing, they need to be well used. So you need to argue why it's the right training data and the right test data to be used. So already in the development stage, there's something like accuracy coming up just on a procedural level. It's not the testing thing anymore. It's as well part of the training to be accurate. And as well, there's some good arguments. Well, it's actually is stated specifically that you need to bring arguments why your accuracy metric is one which is applicable to the intended purpose. Okay. And this all together like motivates us to call accuracy a teleological concept. So it's towards the teleos, towards the goal of the AI system here. It's not about having a formal empirical thing which we can use to measure. It's not a device. Instead, it's more this thing which links to what is the use of the AI system after all. Okay. And that's a funny observation. The EU AI Act assumes somewhat that accuracy reports specifically apply sometimes under certain circumstances to subgroups and individuals. So it's just like it's written in one of the texts that one needs to give something like an individual accuracy. I want you to think of this as being still like this is true, or like I want to see this as accuracy is a thing which applies to individuals. Okay, we later on contrast this with the machine learning perspective, but so far I would like rather understand this as like that's just accuracy, right? And then if we go to the level of comparing among legislation, we note the following: this accuracy thing is like it's not special at all. It's actually it's a rather standard thing, which is in a lot of product safety regulation, as the AI Act is. So there's something called effectiveness in American medical device regulation. It's called clinical benefit in the European one. There's actually something called performance in the construct product regulation. So essentially, like it's really the case that if you would take the term accuracy and check where it occurs in the UI Act, and then you take the term of clinical benefit, for instance, and you check where it occurs, it's very similar, like very similar places. So there's really a strong a comparable line of how people as well have written the EU AI Act. They have looked at other legislation and then just introduced new words, which were somewhat closer maybe to the domain. Because that definitely is an implication of that is like the technical realization of the accuracy measurement of the goodness is specific to the technology. Okay, so for the hiring AIs, like for the hiring system, it's about measuring the goodness, the quality of this of the scores which you get. As a summary, we have that L accuracy is part of compliance performance measures. It's mainly about certifying no harm and the performance. So that's the use of it. It's a teleological concept, different to the machine learning perspective, definitely. It applies to individuals and subgroups. And at the end, it's a legal quality criterion. Now, coming back to this perspective of this worldview that accuracy is both the things together, I want to contrast some aspects which I think then lead to some lessons learned for both the sides, the machine learning side as well as the lawyer side, in terms of what they should do, in terms of what they can do, in terms of what is interesting for both the sides and where they should potentially put more focus on. Number one, in machine learning, essentially accuracy it's a definition of performance, a comparative performance here. On the other hand, from a law perspective, accuracy is just part of something like performance, and it needs to be related to the intended purpose. Otherwise, it's pretty much like a non-relevant concept. For machine learning, the validity of for comparison is somewhat sufficient. So if we just argue one is better than the other, that's okay. It's limited, yes, but it's okay so far as we go. It's like we use accuracy here as a tool for competition, essentially. On the other hand, lawyers are like, whoa, give me a lot of these warrants, of these guarantees. I need you to have it being valid. The accuracy measurement should be valid in a different scenario, under known and foreseeable circumstances, for instance. And so puts a very different focus here. On the other hand, machine learning people obviously say accuracy is statistical measurement, so we measure it on an aggregate, while lawyers say, well, accuracy is applicable to an individual, which is yet another tension here. And from a broader perspective, we essentially have the comparison of a formal empirical concept versus a teleological concept. So this, like, the focus of what this accuracy thing should do is very different. Okay. And with this, I already want to come to essentially the conclusion, the takeaways, which I have for you until now. Essentially, what I want to say is, I'm just recapitulating now the title. So it's going to be a law of large numbers in two respects. First, what we learn from this machine learning world is that when we give statistical warrants, yeah, then these are the statistical warrants which can only be given. Sorry. When we have a statistical technology like machine learning, okay, machine learning is a statistical technology, then the only warrants which we can give in terms of it's going to be good, yeah, are warrants of a statistical nature. Okay, so if I give you a statistical system, it's giving you outputs used based on aggregates of data, then we can only say it's good when we again look at an aggregate of data and check whether it's good. It doesn't really make sense to look at an individual and say it's good on this individual, because the claim of this individual is pretty much arbitrary. Machine learning recognizes this law, I guess, or like seems to not understand this point until now, or like takes it differently. As well, on a higher level, the EU-AI Act essentially codifies a statistical measure of goodness. So it's the statistical measures of goodness apply to systems which are not necessarily statistical ones, as I was arguing. But, and that's the interesting thing, we often use we often use accuracy in a lot of context, with the result that the statistical system is going to be the best ones. Okay, this has been called metrical determinism by Ben Recht in one of his papers last year, where essentially it happens that if coming back to the clinician study I was referring to before, if you look at the clinicians and check out whether they were accurate in their diagnosis, then you notice that a statistical system would have performed if you measured by performance, it would have performed better. Okay, so essentially we going to an aggregate level makes it easier for statistical systems to outperform any other system. And for that reason, the EU-AI Act, I think, is interesting, because it's a law of large numbers. It codifies that we should measure quality in terms of something like a statistical measure of goodness, which we do anyway. We do anyway. We do it for drugs. We do it for other products. But I think it's a rather from a social perspective, it's a rather interesting perspective on how we think in terms of what society is when we think in terms of the long-term effects of such a legislation as the EU-AI Act. Then, on the other hand, from machine learning people, our restriction of performance to accuracy is obviously too limited for the scope of lawyers. So when looking at accuracy for AI system, we should just go more holistic and try to understand what is being accurate with respect to an intended purpose, beyond a number, potentially, beyond an accuracy measure, which is formal and empirical as the way how we are using it now. And why is this a good one to go to? It's because essentially in the EU-AI Act, we're demanding for such a thing. And then that's something which I think statisticians like to hear, but machine learning people less. We need to pay a lot more attention to warrants for validity. Okay, so what I mean by this is when we go back to the hiring example, in the hiring example, a machine learning person would try to optimize this hiring algorithm to be more accurate when comparing to these HR people who scored as well the same set of applicants. But essentially, the EU-AI Act tells us it doesn't really matter whether your scoring there is better than another model. What matters is your argument why this score does not only hold on the people from which you have scored, like where you have scores from the HR, but as well people you have not seen before. Okay. So like the classical things like representativeness of statistics, they matter here a lot more than we machine learning people usually think about. And I think as well from the statistics side, there's a lot more work to be done from here. Like I think we can make arguments which, for instance, don't necessarily need something like IIDness to argue that performance on one population means performance on a different population. And I know in your group, for instance, you're looking at causal graphs to understand this better. And with these takes, I want to conclude that this talk being a bit early, but that's probably no problem. And I'm happy about any questions regarding this this fight of the blue and the red penguin. Thank you.